Guys, welcome to what episode is this? Welcome to the Premed Book Podcast. Today, we're very glad and privileged to have Dr. Krystal Ripa with us today. Dr. Ripa, welcome to the Premed Book Podcast.
Excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. She is really a busy person, but she has made time to speak to us today. So we are really fortunate and thankful, Dr. Ripa. Let's start with an introduction of yourself. Like, who is Dr. Ripa? Let's just start with that.
Yeah. So I am a central New Yorker, which is not New York City, about 4 or 5 hours west of that. But I was born and raised in a super teeny tiny prison town, actually in New York State. I'm a first generation and rural student. And I pride myself on being a physician workforce researcher and a diversity officer who specializes in admissions pathways and pipelines for many different health-related professionals, but primarily has been in medicine.
Wow, that's an interesting background. Shout out to all New Yorkers out here, listening to us. But Dr. Ripa, so what has been your experience with medicine so far? I mean, you did touch on, some of you being involved in the admission process and all of that in App State Medical School. So far, before we get to that, I always ask everyone this, but who was Dr. Ripa back in high school? Let's start with that.
Who was Dr. Ripa back in high school? Okay, so if you were to go to my high school yearbook, you will note that I was nominated as the social butterfly. So okay. I knew everyone. I was in every sport and club, and I love people. I still love people. And so if you were to go back to high school, I had some different phases. I went through like wearing a lot of black phases. I went through the motions just like most of us, but generally I was just the person that everybody knew. I have a really incredible group of friends who I've stayed friends with. We've grown with each other. We've been to each other's weddings, celebrate each other, buying houses, having babies. So I graduated. Actually, we won't talk about how long ago I graduated. We can just leave that as a mystery.
That's fine. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so college. How was college?
So in New York State, we have the largest public state university system in the country. And so it's called SUNY, State University of New York. And I have been a SUNY brat forever. So I went to a SUNY University for my undergraduate in organizational communication. I went to a SUNY for my master's in higher education administration, and then I went to a SUNY for my PhD, which the degree is in curriculum instruction and the science of learning, but I specialized in the physician workforce and primary care shortages, especially their role in furthering the lack of care in underserved communities.
Right. Did you go into college set on what major you're going to do, or was that a journey?
It was a journey. How much I love people and how much I value relationships. I think organizational communications made sense. But I think that organizational communication, what do you do with a career, right? You can do so many things, but it doesn't pinpoint you to one. And I think in my undergraduate, right, my parents had never gone to college. And even though they were helpful and they were supportive, it's very different from understanding what that pathway is by personally walking it. And I think that that's probably a sentiment that some of your listeners can attest to. We actually started a podcast 3 years ago because I feel like we need to make these concepts and these conversations more accessible and less hidden rules of engagement. So when I was a first generation student in undergrad, the people who I saw and the people who were so helpful, and I wanted to be a helper, I've always known I wanted to be a helper, were my academic advisor, particularly a gentleman named Dr. Alex Lyon. And I don't think he even credits himself to know how important he was in my journey, but he truly made me want to be the bridge for students that weren't sure what their next step should, could, or wanted to be. So I went into higher education administration because I saw him and because I wanted to do that. And then it's kind of been a journey since then, still kind of finding what my passions were, what my fit was.
Right. Thank you for that. That's very interesting. So what was your most difficult class back in college?
Oh, back in college. So what's funny, right, is right now I'm in admissions. I work primarily in admissions for medical school. And so I emphasize undergraduate science GPA and science prerequisites. Wouldn't you know, my worst subjects were math and science. So I tell people, I was like, I'm in the part of medicine that doesn't deal with science or blood. I'm in the part that's like, here, let me talk about the really hard things to get to this point, and I'll help you get to the science and the blood. But it's not in the science. I was awful in science.
Right. Okay. Did you love organic chemistry?
No, absolutely not. I don't think I had to take it.
You didn't have to take it. Okay.
No, but the thing is that when I talk to students about organic chemistry, I know that's like a filter course, you know what I mean? And they're always thankful when they don't have to take Org 2 and they have to take biochem instead because there's more like applied concepts. So I've definitely understood, and my pre-health, partners in crime help me to kind of understand what are some of the biggest challenges that our students face in those courses, but I didn't have to do them.
Right. Okay. So we are indeed going to, as you guys can see in the title, just like work-life balance, like her experience in that, and kind of advise us, because she does work with medical students on a regular in a way, and that experience is rich in itself. Most of our viewers are Dr. Ripa. Most of them are currently in college, but they're at the graduate year. So that experience with you working with medical students is needed, in our space. So going to be rich in itself. But also we will be talking later about like what are her tips in terms of how to get into medical school, how to be a successful applicant as a pre-med to med school. So yeah, these are kind of the things we'll be talking about today. So I urge you all to listen to the whole podcast, okay, so you don't miss anything. But Dr. Ripa, let's start with this. Do you think we need diversity in medicine? And if so, why? What are your reasons?
Yeah, so this is something that I am super passionate about. And I think that when we have seen kind of the buzzword of diversity, especially, booming in the past 10 years, I think sometimes people look at that as a box to be checked and numbers to be calculated and not something to continually check ourselves on. Are we not only diversely representing the students, are we including them, right? Are we giving them a sense of culture and environment that they're comfortable in and that they can thrive and succeed in? And so I always say this, I said, diversity is so much more than the performative nature of that word. It is really checking yourself. And as an admissions person, sometimes I struggle because I am responsible for those numbers that I'm now questioning. Those aren't the things that we need to be focused on. Mm-hmm. But, when you think about diversity in our physician workforce, it is critical because data research tells us that our patients are more compliant and receive better care from those who has walked a similar social history or background or experience to them. And so sometimes, right, that is synonymous with race or ethnicity. Sometimes that's synonymous with your geographical location where you grew up, your socioeconomic status, your first generation student, your first generation American. We are able to be better, be more healthy when we have a physician or a high level care provider that understands our journey a little bit more closely.
Absolutely.
So I think that in terms of diversity, it's incredibly, incredibly important. And, some of the pathways and pipelines that I focus on are focused on diversity as it relates to race and ethnicity, and less about kind of defining that broadly, simply because we have to realize that our world was really built on systemically excluding certain populations. So representation in those populations is across specialties just not present. And so race and ethnicity is so important in this world because representation matters for our patients, for our children, and for our communities. And because certain problems present differently, and we need providers who are understanding and competent in some of those different manifests. So there are so many reasons I could take your entire podcast episode and talk about this, me, right, as a white woman. I understand that I'm limited in some of how, right, I could or should or want to speak about this. I particularly work a lot with American Indian and Indigenous students because in especially the past 5 years, of 20,000 students that make their way into medical school, typically we're at 20 of those students being from Indigenous or American Indian backgrounds. And because of that, our death rates among those communities are double and triple the rate of other race and ethnicities. And that to me, right, that to me is just truly tragic, but it's tragic across many represented race and ethnicities.
True. Very true. Yeah. I believe like the last statistics that I checked, which was like back in January, was that currently we have about 4 to 5% of all medical doctors being from the Black population, which is like mind blowing, but I do appreciate the efforts that are being put into these sectors to try to increase that number because like you mentioned, like it's just better, and research has shown that patients do respond, just what you're talking about, do respond positively to doctors that look like them, and just the rare sense of it. So thank you for bringing that up and just expounding on that. Let's just before we do dive into like the med student work-life balance, like let's dive into what are some of the challenges that you face, not particularly being specific in your work, but in kind of your workspace, like trying to be effective, increasing diversity. What are some of the challenges that you face? Yeah.
Well, I think academic medicine is a unique field where those who have a background in diversity and education unfortunately play a very small part. And so you have experts in science and you have experts in medicine. And while a lot of these folks are brilliant and some incredibly well-intended, it's really hard as someone with an expertise in education and diversity to kind of wedge our way into trying to make sure that all the considerations that we're trained to care about and be passionate about also have a place at the table. And I think that there are certain folks, physicians, scientists, faculty who make it their business to know of best practices and really understanding our students' needs and our students' challenges and our students' barriers. But I also think that when you think about bandwidth and physician shortages, how could they? How could they make that a great amount of time when they have so many other things on their plate to balance? So I think one of my biggest challenges is making sure that the knowledge that I have and the expertise that I have has a place at some of those tables where decisions are being made, because there are so many things to consider. And I think that all of our academic medicine professionals, again, are so well intended, but sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And just like I couldn't step into a surgery and take that over, I think it's hard for them to step into my world and sometimes be able to have the same background and the same knowledge as what I bring to the table. So I think that there's a lot of competing interests. I also think that because we are constantly trying to shift and sort through a system that was built to oppress, sometimes the different standards and structures have to be destroyed and destructed before they are rebuilt. And that is hard. That takes time, that takes resources, that takes bandwidth. And so I think that there are many challenges, not necessarily always unique to academic medicine, but that's been my experience is in academic medicine. So that's where I've seen it most present.
Right, right. What do you think about the MCAT?
So being in education, I truly hate and I am, if anybody on this podcast has ever met me, has ever heard from me, has ever been at a presentation, everyone knows I'm pretty transparent. I will tell you my feelings, but say, hey, we have to deal with our feelings and still play into the cards that will get you into medical school. So let's be strategic and let's really talk about those things outwardly. So I think that nationally, right, those MCAT percentiles were recently retooled to put some of our students that were scoring in the median at a disadvantage. So I think a 500 is now the 43rd percentile, and up until recently, it was a 50th percentile. And so I think that medical schools, especially with the change of step 1 to pass fail, I unfortunately think medical schools are not well equipped to understand necessarily what that means and how to best prepare students. So perhaps they're going to start relying on the MCAT again even more to be able to sift and sort, which is it's just really hard. And when you think about, right, the space that education experts have at the table in terms of academic medicine, you try to remind folks that we need to be holistically minded about applicants, because a student that is a second generation physician with all of the access and opportunities and resources to, understand that they need to shadow, they need to have like 7,000 different ways to study for the MCAT is not an advantage that everyone will have. So when you talk about holistic admission, it's about distance traveled, as well as it is the overall package that a student brings to the table. And I think sometimes the MCAT people see, if I bring in someone below a certain MCAT threshold, I will be failing them on those physician licensure boards. And to some extent, each institution has to be able to assess, okay, we brought in students at this particular MCAT score, and was that commonly associated or correlated with them struggling on particular shelf exams, step exams, benchmark exams? And I think for some institutions, the answer to that has been unfortunately yes. And so I think MCAT helps institutions defend themselves when they can't kind of broaden their range of MCAT score recipients, because they don't have the academic support to really bring those students in and help them succeed. And I think that all these things can be true and still unfair.
Okay. Right. In a sense, do you think that we're being just standardized tests in general? I mean, for some reasons, we do have to have some kind of metric to kind of like level the playing field. But in other ways too, I mean, a lot of research is backing the fact that the MCAT isn't leveling the playing field. Let with details that you just pointed out. Do you think that we are being perhaps lazy in a way to assess the other metrics of actually being a student being successful in med school? Because there's been a lot of research out there proving that the MCAT is not necessarily the best metric of someone being a successful medical student. Just like the SAT and ACT, clearly, even in my own experience, does not accurately predict someone's success in college. What do you say to that? And then we move on to like the med student work-life balance. Yeah.
Yeah. So I feel like we sometimes forget that standardized exams are a comfort because it's a standard. It's the same across everything. And I think a better predictor of success can be the undergraduate science GPA and letters of recommendation, but the variation among institution, and some of us try to standardize undergraduate science GPA or cumulative science GPA by institutional rankings. The Barron's rankings is one many of us use. But, right, there is still variation, so much variation. And then when you think of letters of recommendation, sometimes letters of recommendation are also us trying to assume that there is a privilege that a student has been able to build, who we define have to submit letters of recommendation. They built those relationships to be as positive or longstanding and as deep if they're working and if they are taking on a full course load, if they have a family at home. So I think those letters of recommendation, I think that they can help us to understand students at a deeper level, resiliency and, positivity, solution focus, some things that will really help them succeed in medical school. But again, those are assumptions of privilege because there are students such as myself. I had to work my entire time as an undergrad. So do you think that I was able to spend a ton of time building relationships and extracurriculars all the time, or perhaps diving into these much deeper relationships with teaching assistants or my professors? No, I was not. And so those letters of recommendation and us leaning on those as heavily can be problematic. I still tell students that committee letters, if you don't have a committee, the substitution letters, make sure that you're not just checking a box, that you're truly seeking out those people who can write a positive letter. But the undergraduate science GPA, I think, is another good predictor, but it is incredibly varied across the board. So I don't know if it's necessarily, I think that we are evolving, not as quickly as we can, should, or need to. I think that we are evolving to be able to not standardize those things, but use them on more of a standard scale. I just think it's not happening fast enough to make change in the ways in which this nation really needs. We have a really looming, it's not even looming anymore. We have an acute primary care shortage that is going to circumstantially affect underserved communities most. And we are still, continuing to fight battles of letters of recommendation and MCAT. Instead of
it's already started. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. By 2025, we're going to, or 2035, we're going to be in a world of trouble.
Yeah, we need to act quickly.
Well,
yeah.
Be leaning on nurse practitioners, physician assistants, osteopathic medicine, because allopathic medicine is kind of stuck in a very traditional place. So we need to start looking at our other options too.
Right. Well, okay. That's what I was just about to say. Perhaps, starting with a good starting place will perhaps be, in my opinion, just finding a way to perhaps standardize all GPAs calculations, how it's calculated across universities, especially when it comes to people on the pre-med track across the nation. Like you mentioned, there are metrics that, I guess admissions people use to do that in a way, but perhaps that would be a good starting place. But anyways, thank you, Dr. Ripa. So let's
Yeah.
talk about med student work-life balance. I mean, you are in that space. Like, what has been the conversations with medical students, and what advice do you have, in such ways?
Yeah. So I think that for pre-med students and medical students, balance is not only not only nice, it's necessary. It truly is. And I think this goes beyond med students and pre-med students.
Mm,
I think that you take anyone, right? And if they are always kind of at the grind 24/7, they're going to get burnt out.
yeah.
I think that for pre-med students who are working so incredibly hard to make themselves marketable and competitive for medical school, I think especially for them, they have to remember that the medical school that you are supposed to go to, and I think that there are still some medical schools that are too wrapped up in kind of just being tough and being rigid and being traditional. But I think that the medical school you are supposed to go to will want to see balance in your background.
Mm,
Balance in terms of having, yes, clinical experiences in doing well academically, but also immersing yourself in something long term that you love and brings you joy and is outside of medicine or is service oriented, that you love. Because if you come into medical school with clinical experience and you're booking the nose the whole time, or you're booking the nose in the book the whole time, what are you going to be talking to your patients about? Your patients, you should assume, right, that literacy level across patient populations varies greatly, but you always want to come into those interactions with a approach of access and
mm,
comfort and relationship building. And so being able to relate to them about something that's not on their workup or not on their blood panel that you're looking at
yeah.
is going to, just like someone from a social background similar to them, someone with a hobby or a passion outside of medicine, they're going to be more comfortable. They're going to open up more. And typically, you find out more in that workup about a differential or a diagnosis than you do in a blood panel.
Mm,
So I think that the well balance, it serves such a purpose. And I think that for medical students, that
yes.
work-life balance looks a little bit differently than
Mm,
pre-med students, because although they're still trying to make themselves marketable and competitive for residency, they are now in the level of academic rigor where you probably heard it or said it 1,000 times on this podcast. It is like water from a fire hydrant.
yes.
And so that level of burnout can
Mm,
happen much more rapid, much more intense. And students find themselves questioning, why did I want this? Why did I work so hard at this? Whenever I see one of my students, and because of the nature of my work, I get very close with my students because I'm
mm,
typically working with them for 1, 2, 3, 4 years before they matriculate to medical school. And so those students text me, those students call me. I mean, we just have such a relationship. So if I see them in the hall and I know that they are in that place where they're like, oh my gosh, I'm like, go to the clinic, go to the clinic. You need to remember why you're doing this. And why you were doing this in the beginning was to be a helper and to work with your patients.
right.
And every single student who I've told to do that almost always looks at me annoyed initially and then comes back and is like, okay. And it all becomes more central focus for them.
Okay.
So that work-life balance in that way. But also, I tell my students almost every day, do something that brings you joy. Do something
Mm,
that brings you joy. And it's kind of those things that you hear all the time. Eat well and sleep and work out. But truly, if you are not taking care of your physical and your mental well-being,
mm.
how are you going to show up for that fire out of the water or water out of a
Fire
fire,
hose. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
How are you going to
Right.
show up?
Yep. Yeah. That is true. That is true. Thank you for that. Wow. So when you say clinic, you mean therapy, or you mean just them interacting with patients, like for them to realize why they're there? Can you explain what you mean by when you said clinic, for them to go to the clinic?
Yeah. So, I mean, for some of them, they may be seeking counseling. It wouldn't be a suggestion I would ever make casually to them. They
Okay.
may be, right? But when I say clinic, I mean, go to whatever clinical experience that you have going on at this point in time, of which we
Hmm.
provide many opportunities to either shadow. We are an institution that our director for the Center for Civic Engagement she's phenomenal. And that center allows our students the opportunity to ethically and morally and with appropriate level of training be in the community, and helping the community, sometimes in a clinical capacity, like running our clinics for the homeless that are having like foot problems or injuries. We have a clinic that does that. And so that's another way in which a lot of our students are involved, but some of our students actually go right into our hospital because we're an academic medical center, and they're shadowing or they're actually working in the emergency rooms or things like that. And those experiences become fewer and far between when you're right in the middle of didactic kind of basic science years.
Hmm.
Especially true because medical schools are feeling the pressure to continue to condense the time in those basic science curriculums. So
Mm.
while our institution is just adjusting to an 18-month basic science curriculum, some schools are now jumping from 18-month down to 12-month. So I feel like
Interesting.
that crunch of time is going to make things even exasperated as far
Mm.
as burnout goes, and these lessons, these conversations that you're having right now, these questions that you're asking will
Yeah.
become even more important.
Right. So in a way, in an effort to, I guess, increase the amount of clinical hours med students are getting, in a way, it's also affected, I guess, like the crunching of material, in a very short time. In a way, is that pretty much what you're saying?
Yeah, so a
Mm.
lot of medical schools are trending towards that, condensing the basic science curriculum.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, for shedding light on that. That's why we are doing this, guys. So that we have more insight into the medical field and the decisions we're making. Just to get, what a status quo is. So thank you very much, Dr. Ripa. My next question is, when it comes to MS1s, MS2, MS3, MS4, what are the differences that you've seen in, these various years in terms of student behavior, um, and just like in general, what differences do you see? Yeah, and if you can break it down for us, especially for the freshman college students out there, what does each year involve? I guess you can use Upstate Medical School for as an example. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that within just what's happening in the medical school, we also have to recognize that students face their own challenges throughout those years. And so if we are dwindling it down to just their medical school experience and ignore that they have a personal life, right, too, and challenges there, which is hard. I think that first year of medical school, I always tell students it's like your freshman year in college. If
Mm.
you've never taken an AP course or you've never been in the college environment, it's kind of a shock to the system, right? And in some ways, you almost have to go back to the basics and not necessarily dive into the content, but into the science of learning and into how to really sharpen your study school skills and knowing yourself in how your individualized learning style and approach can be effective and can be best utilized in the medical school environment, because the level in the difficulty of the content is just like none other. And so I think that first year there are so many adjustments, and the adjustments aren't just to the curriculum and to the knowledge, it's also to a new space, a new environment. You're getting to know the resources. And so if you can go into a bridge or a pre-matriculation program to kind of knock some of those things off, like, knock off, okay, I know where the library is, I know where I'm going to go shopping, I'm getting kind of a particular mode that I can set myself in, a routine, if you will. I think that that's really helpful if anybody has the choice or the option to do a pre-matriculation program to get your footing. I think that in the second year, it is challenging because yes, you are more familiar with the learning style, but you are also facing step one coming. And I think that initially, when we all learned that step one was switching from numerically calculated to pass fail, there was almost a sense of comfort. But then when you look at the national failure rates of step one from the last year, you're like, oh, got too comfortable. And so now I think that in this transition period, after seeing that first year, I think students are kind of frozen in fear, because I still think the medical schools are probably catching up with how to best advise and support students in that transition. I think that, like us, some medical schools are building kind of in-house assessments to be able to help students understand where they land at specific times. But I also think that in that second year, you're also preparing yourself to make sure that you're ready for third year. So not only are you preparing yourself for a huge licensure exam, you're preparing yourself to transition into an environment where you've had some experience, but we all know that it's a less controlled environment when you're in clerkships. And in those clerkships, you will be rotating so quickly through a lot of different high, low, fast-paced, different types of environments, and you're assessed on those. And some of the clinicians you will come into contact with will probably be the most incredible people ever. And some will probably not necessarily know as much about education or how to be impactful with lessons they're trying to teach you. And so it's hard. It's really, really, really hard. And so that third year is exciting, but it is also one where you have to study after having just worked a 14-hour day. So I think time management in the first and the third year are probably the hardest. And especially each of those years have really, really big adjustments. In third year, you almost have an adjustment either every 6 or every 12 weeks when you're going through the clerkships and rotations. While a lot of institutions that are determining how you will go through that clerkship year have a lottery system and don't give you an option of how to kind of stack your cards there, I think that you have to be flexible, you have to be adaptable, and just like you did your first year, know your learning style best. If you have to show up for surgery at 6 a.m., but you don't get out until 6 p.m. and then you still have to study for your shelf or for the cases for the next day, just know that you are going to really, really be in a crunch for personal life, for balance, but somehow you have to strive and be able to achieve that to not burn out. And then I think fourth year is like an incredible time because everything starts coming to a culmination, a close, but in like a really nerve-wracking way. So I think that you're most comfortable, you've got the most experience under your belt, of course, you're towards the end, but it's also the culmination of a really, really hard experience where you still have so much on the line. And it's not until almost the very end, through a very weird, problematic, arduous kind of calculated system, that you match. And so I feel like as much that you've tried to take into your control and do well, worked so hard to have something be left completely out of your control in the match system. So I think in your fourth year, you're transitioning more to acting internships or away electives, which are kind of the clerkships or the rotations where you're becoming more competitive or getting your feet wet more in the specialty in which you are hoping to apply to for residency.
Yeah.
And then in September, your residency applications go in. And those residency applications are a little bit more difficult now because with step one being pass fail, there's more pressure on step two, clinical skills and clinical knowledge, and on
Yes.
your curriculars, all the things that you've done. So in order to put in a well-rounded application, you really have to be thoughtful from the beginning about how
Yeah.
you approach that.
I was just about to ask you, what are some of the positives and negatives of making, that decision that went into making step one, pass and fail, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that the positives and negatives, I think that when you're shopping for medical schools,
Yeah.
depending on who you are, you want to shop for a place that, for me, I would want collaborative versus competitive. And I
Mm,
think that while many medical schools have attempted that, I think the hope that switching from numeric to pass fail
mhm,
was an opportunity that medical schools nationally could leverage in being more collaborative in learning styles and approach and less competitive. What I think it has done is
mm,
created some unknowns. I don't know as much about the transition for the step one and some of the risk and rewards that were weighed along the way. I
mhm,
just know our students were excited initially, and like I mentioned, got comfortable.
mm.
And while medical schools are still learning how to prepare students in that transition, the failure rates last year are real scary.
Okay.
So I think it is something that we tested the water, we dipped our toes in, and I don't love the outcome. I think that
Mm,
once we get kinks worked out, I think that it will be for the better. I think that I don't love that the cost in the initial phases of student satisfaction, comfort, and safety, you know?
yeah. Perhaps we got too comfortable. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, honestly, thank you for the honesty. Because it almost looks like going into first year, you kind of have to have your plan out. Like otherwise, you could be in hot water in a way.
How do you mean your study plan or your residency competitiveness plan? Both?
Not well in some ways both, but not necessarily too much of residency, but have a plan for that. Um, yeah,
Yeah. Well, one thing I will say is that I feel like as a nation
yeah,
and in medical schools, we assume primary care to be the safe bet instead of the desirable bet. And I
mm,
think that if there is one thing through, your podcast or any way that we can start to change that thought, primary care is service at this point, right? Like we in some of these underserved communities are facing just dismal, primary care providers in those communities. In some of like the affluent suburban neighborhoods, like I'm not worried about them. I'm really not. I think that our shortage of primary care physicians as a nation will hurt referrals, will hurt specialty services, all these downtrodden effects. But I'm most worried about those communities that are already in trouble for healthcare and
mm,
how this will continue to cause more avoidable deaths, more accidental deaths, even. So I think that one ploy I would put out there that will perhaps make students feel better about compiling a competitive residency application. Trend towards primary care. Put into your back pocket that if you right now make an active decision that that's your goal and that's where your heart puts you, it will put you in a position to know that during your medical school years, do you want to do research? Cool. If that sets your belly on fire, go for it. But you can also commit yourself to service and being in the clinic and do things that bring you joy and know that I want to be a primary care physician because it's the work that I'm needed to do or that we're needed in. And I think that goes
yeah,
for anybody. But I also know people are called to medicine because they want to be surgeons or they want to be
yes,
cardiothoracic,
mm,
physicians.
yeah,
And so get that.
right,
But I think that sometimes we just have to think about switching primary care from being a safe bet to being the
mm.
ideal track.
That's interesting. That's a gem. That's a gem right there. Yeah, that deserves a shout out. Okay, so yeah, that was so good. I forgot my next question. I was gonna say this. Yes. So I'm so glad you brought that up because that's why I started this podcast in the first place to kind of like give people out there interested in medicine. There are so many paths into medicine and so many paths in medicine. So that's what this is all about. So thank you for that, Dr. Ripa.
Well, I'll
Last
commend
question.
you. Well, I'll commend
Yes.
you because there
Thank you.
aren't enough people asking the questions and putting people that have the insight or have those hidden rules of engagement as their profession on the spot, right? So we should be providing access and answers to more complex questions and to helping all of our prospective doctors, future students understand all the nuances and all the considerations and be their most strategic applicant because at the end of the day, we need healers.
Right. That's true. That's true. Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Um, Last question is what is your advice, like, or series of advice that you have for pre-meds out there listening, perhaps even first year, second year, third year medical schools, but particularly because this is the pre-med lifeboat, what advice do you have for pre-meds out there listening to us?
So I always tell people my two biggest things are apply early and apply broadly.
Mm.
My third thing is apply strategically, right? Leveraging residency, using the MSAR to put together your applications. But those are specifically admissions advice that you could look up on the websites and know.
Mm.
The other thing I will say is do things that bring you joy. Do not compile a medical school application based off of a checklist that you've read off of studentdoctor.network.
Hmm.
If you are compiling a medical school application by things you think you need to do rather than what brings you joy, that authenticity is lost.
Hmm.
And you want to apply to and get into a medical school, even though I know medical school applications and admissions is a game, right? And you've got to try to air the odds in your favor. But if you apply to a med school that doesn't see you as your genuine and authentic self, and they accept you as something else, when you go there, do you think that your genuine self is going to be in a position to thrive?
Hmm.
And so I think that sometimes people have a hard time hearing me say that because you're like, listen, I'm just trying to get into medical school. I'm not ready to be picky or choosy. But shouldn't you be?
Hmm.
This is where you're spending your time, your effort, and your money. And as though it may feel like we are the pickers and choosers of who becomes healers, you should be picky about who you are giving your time, effort, and money to. Because at the end of the day, the indebtedness of our physicians is significant, and that shouldn't be lost on us or you. And so I truly want students to be the most genuine self. And sometimes that takes more reflection than I think that we have time to give it. And I think that if there's anything that from this talk that you walk away from is to taking the time and really asking what you want to do, what you want to, end up in 10 or 15 or 20 years. And sometimes those conversations of reflection also separate yourself from, is this my goal for myself, or is this a goal that someone else wanted for me? We have a lot of families or a lot of students that are applying, and you can tell there's a lot of familiar pressure to pursuing this path. And so sometimes, not always, right, those the urge to reflect, you come across that. And this goal becomes either more central focus or a distant yesterday.
Right. Right. Wow. Wow. What a podcast this has been, guys. I hope this was helpful. I mean, I had, this was fun. This was a fun conversation, diving into the nuances of so many things. Um, Dr. Ripa, thank you. Like this was informative. This was great. Guys, join me to say a big thank you to Dr. Ripa. Like I said, she's very busy, but she's made time almost an hour to speak with us. So thank you, Dr. Ripa. Until we meet again, guys, it's bye for now. See you in the next episode. Bye.